Hello everyone, hopefully I'm not too late because we are counting down the top 10 worst Monstercat songs of 2023. I'll say this, 2023 was a year for Monstercat. While it wasn't as bad as 2020 with the lackluster singles and the shock and awe that was 2021, the feeling I got from this year was just What it reminds me most is 2018, where the year was very consistent across the board, plus a huge schedule change for the label. Instead of another label split, it was a schedule change. And I would argue, unlike 2018, where it was ultimately best for both Uncaged and Instinct, this year didn't feel like that. And while I'd argue the schedule change was good for Silk, it didn't do much for Uncaged as it continued on as normal with most divisive of the sublabels, and Instinct plummeted into mediocrity, as I've already talked about on my main channel. And while the summer months and November shook up the year, when one of your sublabels fell off, it did affect the rest of the year. It wasn't a bad year by any means, but I'd be lying if I said my investment in the label wasn't tested at times. It doesn't help matters when two albums were as divisive as you can get, and October flat out sucked. And that pattern reflects on the worst list, where most of the songs except for the top 3 are just standard bad rather than atrocious, which is why they were easy pickings. The pattern I saw with this list are monotonous tracks that endlessly repeated with little variation or anything noteworthy, a lot of abrasive dubstep that crosses the line of annoyance, and songs that relied on a lot of name recognition and star power when the song in question wasn't very good. So with that said, let's not waste any more time. The same rules apply for last year, no remixes or VIPs, and 1 to 2 artists per song. So let's start with our dishonorable mentions in no specific order. I'll be honest, when the year started, I found this to be fine. Sure, it wasn't anything special, but I could still bop to this, until about 7 months later, where I returned to this single and realized nothing was really happening. We get a thumping kick, some vocal whoops, and an endlessly repeating synth lead that's very much uninteresting, along with some reverb vocal effects trying to make the song more grand than it is. All the song has going for it is that a big name, Data Life, debuts with a somewhat familiar name, the Monstercat, that being Dexter King. Unfortunately, what we got is one of the worst songs from Data Life, and the worst from Dexter King. What a way to fumble. Ride, motherfuckers! Fuck it. This was a moment on Salva King's Throne of Blood that I almost threw in the towel. Seriously, this sounds like the most basic Brittum song you can create. It seems this only exists to pad out the length of the album. It's a good thing my rules prevent me from talking about Overthrown, the remix package, because that was terrible and somehow worse, but this is still bad irregardless. And this isn't the last time we'll see Salva King on this list. How is it that you get 2 producers who are fairly decent at creating house tunes and get them to create one of the most boring Instinct tunes I've heard in recent memory? The tropical synths are completely wasted as it's used for literally 1 note. The attempt to gradually build elements doesn't work since it barely changes up the 1-note groove of the song, and the beat is completely simplistic with your basic snare and kick drum. In other words, no master would have made this. Eat, sleep, rage, dog in the fucking grave! Volpatron Ascends was really disappointing. You expect someone like Ray Volp to give off some wacky, absurdist dubstep songs he's well known for, but with the exception of Happy Song and maybe Drop It, that didn't happen. And this was the worst of that EP, primarily because it's heavy just for the sake of it. Just like with Salva King, he makes a really generic sounding Brittum tune out of it. I'll admit, there are some cool sounds here, but the flat screeches, the simplistic nature of the song, it hold it back a lot. Eat, Sleep, Rage? More like Eat, Sleep, Disengage. Let's let's get this out of the way. The controversy behind this song is really stupid. Yes, it's a funk song. That doesn't automatically mean that Monstercat is dead, especially when I've argued they've done a lot worse. I mean, where were you when Godlands dropped a funk EP last year? That said, Get in the Car is still pretty terrible. For those of you who are unaware, Thirst is a funk project comprised of Roy Knox, Bad Computer, and Have. So for them to make a song that's barely 2 minutes that contains a looping funk synth and flat percussion seems rather odd, until you hear that Roy Knox and Bad Computer didn't even work on this song, and that was made only by one half of the duo Have. In that case, it makes complete sense. It's missing this list because it's more bland bad, and Thirst would make a comeback with Drifter, a collaboration with Fool, and Outside singles that prove that they're more than capable of experimenting with the funk style. But it doesn't stop this song from making it here. Next.
Go against me, that's war. Rocking these booty shorts, partying bored. They want some more. Girl, you look tore up from the floor.
Oh, I expect this will make other people's lists, but for me, it's missing this list because there are a few redeeming elements in the production. Still doesn't change the fact that War isn't very good. How do you get Rico Nasty on this song? One of your biggest debuts on the entire label, and all you get her to do is repeat the same basic lines over and over again, and repeat the phrase, "Go against me, that's war." Not to mention, sounding like she'd want to be anywhere else but here. And then there's Nostalgics, who gets her own verse where she attempts to sound like Iggy Azalea and has lines like, "Love me, hate me, watch me go. You try to fight, let's even the score." And those are the most interesting lines in her entire verse. The best I could say is that the production is well produced, even if I don't like that squeaky lead. Regardless, this War is the equivalent of a Nerf gun fight. Jessica, why? I mean, the song itself isn't that bad. The first half is actually really good with that guitar lick, the vocals from Able Faces, and that drop is solid with some 8-bit synth design that incorporates well into the future bass synths and sharper snare, until we get to the second drop that throws that out the window for a random heavy drop with an awful sustain and incredibly weak synth stabs. The song was completely fine. We didn't need a heavy drop. Save that for another single. Instead, what we get is the film equivalent of a romance where one of the partners finally says, "I love you" to the other, but before they kiss, cuts to 2 trains with clowns crashing into each other, and the clowns covered in blood start dancing. Oh yeah, and they're also setting on fire. Words cannot describe how much I just cannot stand Mackie Gee's music. When I first heard of this guy, he was on his remix of Distance by Apache, which was awful, and his drum and bass style always bothered me due to it being obnoxious and flat. So imagine my reaction when I heard he was going to be on Monstercat. Safe to say this was terrible. His trademark synths are back and just as obnoxious as last time. The production sounds flat and hollow, and the awkward vocal fragments that have an off-putting filter to them does not help matters. I'm honestly shocked that this did not have enough room to make the list proper. But speaking of which, onto the list proper, starting with number 10. I honestly tried to get the appeal of this artist, more specifically, this song. I was even contemplating leaving it off this list entirely because, hey, it seemed like most people enjoyed this, and I at least get the appeal to this. Maybe it would be the sort of song where it's not for me, but I would get it. But there's a certain limit to that argument for me, because on the other side, you need a few things that are redeemable. So while you have a song like Vermin by Boss Fight, a song I still don't really like, it has a few redeeming elements. This, on the other hand, I could start with the obvious. That grating synth twinkle in the beginning sounds awful. It's a sort of drunken feeling that's less having a good time and more having a bad hangover. And unfortunately, is always on this track. But let's talk about that appeal that I was mentioning earlier. Because, yes, that distorted bass is well produced, and it does sound good. Shame there's nothing else to work with. The synth stabs sound really annoying building up to the drop, and then there's the drop itself, which the bass swallows that frail trap knock, and that awful twinkle I just mentioned. And with a runtime that's under 2.5 minutes, plus the fact that the drops don't change. No, I'm sorry, this is bad. While I get the appeal to something like this, which is why it's not higher, when there's so much that's unpleasant to listen to, and the feeling that Sippy has done better, yeah, no, it's not escaping this list. At least for me. Number 9. Many of you who watch my ranking channels probably expected this to be a lot higher on my list. It's collectively agreed upon as one of the worst, if not the worst song on Monstercat this year. But it fell back on me for 2 reasons. Number 1, there's a song on this list that fails its concept even more than this did. And 2, I could sort of see an audience for this, and at the very least, they tried with this concept. But that doesn't mean it's not making my list. One of my biggest pet peeves in music are songs that try to equate food with sex. Is there a possible tune that does this well? Maybe. But for the most part, it always sounds gross, and it's about one of the last things I want to think about when eating. So imagine me trying to listen to this song, which is all about that. Most of that is towards the hook, which contains the line, "Wanna suck on me and see if that's the only thing that comes." There's also a verse talking about her sexual desires, and she finds satisfaction from honey dripping from the tree. Then there are lines that just fail altogether. The fruit tastes good when it's forbidden. I mean, as a Christian, that's not as edgy as you think it is. But here's the irony. Despite the fact that I really don't like these lines, you could tell that there was at least some effort put into them, and I have to give some props to that, for some of the creative lyrics, as well as Sarah DeWarren trying to act seductive here, something I cannot say about Weird Genius's production. Between the goopy synth pads, the cheap horns, the awful mixing in the drop, which has the vocals swap out everything from the weak bass and snap, it sounds so artificially made, completely lacking in that sex appeal. And that's not a good thing when your song is all about that. So yeah, I still don't like this. This sugar has gotten stale. Number 8. So Brittum was a common genre on Monstercat for some reason. I mean, in between Sullivan King's Thrones of Blood LP and Shaq's Guerrilla Warfare, there wasn't a whole lot of variation. Most of the songs sounded so similar that it was the equivalent of the house spam Instinct had pretty much the whole year except for the end. And I remember in that video I mentioned how it would benefit the songs if they had some interesting sound design. But at the same time, that doesn't solely make a song good. It's more of an ingredient, a basic solution to spice things up. So the worst thing that could happen is when you undercook your steak so you try to put seasoning on it. This is what happens when that line of logic is put into a rhythm track.
All that other shit fucking senseless. Check
I want to remind everyone, for COD Dubs, this is one of the better tunes he released this year, but that's likely because Squishy did most of the legwork for him. Unfortunately, COD Dubs and Squishy cancel each other out, and what we get at the end is this. A tune that wastes a pretty good build-up with the metal clang and bassy synth line for a run-of-the-mill quarter-note rhythm drop, with some sound design to distract from how basic this is. The synth plate that sounds like a bird tweeting might sound cool, or the gurgling synth bass on the second drop, but between the flat synth growls, the vacant atmosphere, the vocal samples that sound really bad, the sharp tinny sustain that sounds grating, I don't consider that a win. The only reason it's not higher is because that third drop is fine, switching into a more melodic rhythm pattern and abandoning some of its really bad synth work from the other 2 drops. This is still a really bad song though. Next, number 7. I remember in January, some rankers put Get Through by Coven near the bottom of their lists. The argument was that the song was repetitive, using a basic drum and bass sample, and that Coven had done this multiple times. And while I could get behind their arguments, I've actually made some of them with their other songs, Get Through is more okay than outright bad. Yeah, it's pretty repetitive. Yes, it's a genre that Coven has done before, and often better, but at least the song had some emotional qualities to it. Between the guitar lick, the gentle pianos, the violins, there was something to get attached to. Now, if you want a track with the same genre, released the same month, that's even more repetitive and has none of the pathos, if you've been in the EDM scene for a few years, you may have heard of the name Denmo before. He got his big success thanks to Zed's Dead and Suburban, the Cradles guy. But fortunately, when you look at his early catalog, you realize there wasn't much to him. Mostly a bunch of basic future bass and trap hits. So when he made his transition to drum and bass last year, it was a nice change of pace, except when it comes to this song. Deandra Faye, for the brief time she's on here, has a misty vocal performance to make this work. Unfortunately, by the time the drop comes in, the pathos gets blown to ashes, with a buzzing bass that's pushed way too close, a beeping lead that has no impact to it, and percussion that exists. And this goes on for 4.5 minutes. It barely gives us much variation besides switching up that lead melody. Except with how weak the lead is, it barely makes a difference. Thankfully, Denmo redeemed himself later by releasing Blinding, which is a good song, and thankfully became the more popular tune, because this, it ain't it. Number 6. Just a forewarning, there's going to be a certain pattern on this list moving forward. Some of these songs this year took some time to sour on me. I didn't immediately hate these songs from the jump. Often I just gave it 1 or 2 listens, found them to be somewhat tolerable or just bad but not the worst category, until months later when I returned to them and realized how bad some of these tunes are. So if you're wondering why Crank Dat or the Pegboard Nerds didn't show up, it's not only because Move Back and Euphoria grew on me, it's also because there are a few songs that I completely sidestepped. For example, Skylar Madison's catalog has been one of the most disappointing things I've heard this year. For those of you who don't remember who she was responsible for Phoenix in 2021, a decent hard wave tune with enough sound design to keep it interesting, and Chasing Stars, which was fine. She came back to Monstercat this year with a few decent singles, Hit My Line and Fix Me, before crashing hard with the rest of her singles off her EP, Chrome Hearts. But while the self-titled track was bland and uninspired, and Fall was awkward and outdated thanks to Godlines' Crashing, Haunt You is boring. It's Skylar at her absolute worst, resorting to a stuttering, distorted synth lead that sounds flat and unappealing, a drop percussion that's weak and gets swallowed by the synths, the generic brass horns that you could barely hear, and a vocal chop that gets stale fast. And for a runtime that's under 3 minutes, those are not elements that you should combine. And it sucks because I saw some potential in Skylar in 2021 only for it to go nowhere. It's not higher on this list because it's more just bland bad, and the fact that Skylar has attempted to get more experimental after the EP. Skylar, you've done a lot better. Number 5. I think it's common knowledge that you need to handle criticism well, myself included. I say this because there was an off-label album made by a Monstercat artist that got backlash for being too short. So in response, he decided to make a long song that was the same length as his EP. In general, it's a pretty good response to criticism. He gets to address it, and his audience gets a new song. If he made the song well, this should be a win, except he didn't, and returns to the song months later after somewhat appreciating it. I realized it would have been better if he moved on. Wales on this label has been very rough. While he's made a few good singles like Souvenir and It's Not Love, most of his catalog has been a mess of bad dubstep. Royalty was a dishonorable mention last year, and 2021, Locked Away and Stand By Me would have probably made it very high on that worst list. Which leads me to this. An absolute mess of a track that I thought was a nice experiment until you realize how, except for that drum and bass drop, nothing is memorable or interesting. The drops are abrupt, making for a completely jarring listen. It would be one thing if it was like The Faceless by Murata or any of the Voltage compilations from Space Places, where the whole point was to showcase some unreleased songs to get people hyped. No Rules isn't doing that. So when the abrupt transitions happen, they completely take you out. And that's before we get to the rest of the drops. The dubstep and color-based ones go on for way too long, overstaying their welcome, even as Wales tries and fails to keep things interesting. The lo-fi, chiptune, and trap drops feel tacked on, lacking any sense of purpose beyond filling up the runtime. The halftime drop near the middle lacks any low one for it to hit as hard as it wants to, but the worst drop is the last one, where Wales decided to create new worlds but worse in every way, with a frail knock of the snare, the synth stabs, the obnoxious vocal hum. This feels more like a commercial for his Two Worlds album than a track. The song sounds as uninteresting as it is. And after this song came out, after the discourse just died, despite there being no rules, it might be good if you at least made some to improve your work. That's all I'm saying. Number 4. This one might be a little bit controversial, mostly because the community probably views this as middle of the road. And given the input of Instinct this year is expected at this point, it's like watching the sunrise, you know it will be run of the mill. So why is that so high on this list? Well, let me try and explain why. If there's an artist I would say encapsulates Instinct in 2023, it's Britt Larry. While she had one song in the beginning of the year, Say My Name, that was generic but fun, the rest of her songs on the label have been so uninteresting and mid that I'm certain most of you forgot they even happened. Which leads into All About You, her second solo song that tries to capture the fun again, but completely fails. I'll say this, if there's one thing about Britt Larry that's consistent, it's her vocal performance. And here, it's her best vocal performance on the label, having a vocal presence to carry a song like this while showing that she can have some fun. And because of that, it's not any higher on this list. Shame she's stuck with the worst production I've heard on Instinct this year. Say what you want about the house spam, at least you could tell that there was some production quality, which is what Darlington was trying to go for. So why repeating by punctual is missing this list. But here, it sounds terrible. The vocals engulf the entire production, including the faint tropical synths, the piano keys, the hollow clap, and the drop is one of the biggest upsets I've heard in a while. With the barely audible bleeps of synth, the claps that sound like a really bad drum preset, and an absolutely unappealing vocal chop. It sounds thrown together, completely lacking in any focus. Even if Say My Name had some of those mixing issues, it was at least fun. This isn't. Hopefully Britt Larry continues to make more of the former, and not this. Number 3. I've heard the argument that you have to have a set identity if you're a music producer, often extending to a certain music genre. And while I agree to some extent, I feel like the mentality discourages the artist from ever evolving. Look at Stonebank for example. One of the reasons he's kept his image in the first place is because he's willing to try out new things outside of electro house or happy hardcore. Now on the other hand, when you have no identity outside of name recognition, rely on other artists, and then you make an entire album based around that, yeah, in that case, I agree. So Shaquille O'Neal, under his DJ alias, Diesel released Guerrilla Warfare. It was basically what happened if DJ Khaled became a dubstep artist. Loads of memes, sure, but he often relied on other producers, and every song on the album was like this. Which is fine if you have Heritage, Crank That, and Company on your track, or when your own style pokes its head out, like in No Fear, that one's with Jessica Diffrid. The problem is when you rely on artists that aren't very good. Warzone with Rated R barely missed this list, and Watch Your Back is far worse. Because we're stuck with VRG on production, and man, it's bad. The ugly gurgling metallic stab that's repeated constantly, the loud buzzing synth that gets on my nerves, the generic trap snare, the awful switch up on the second drop with a grating sustain. It resembles the absolute worst of dubstep. Loud and obnoxious, so much so that it makes you want to listen to anything else. Think Headbanger's Ball by Slander. And then there's Black Way. For those of you who don't know, he was responsible for making the Into the Spider-Verse hit What's Up Danger, a song that was integral to the development of Miles Morales as a character. So seeing him on this project, where he's on autopilot, it was really disappointing, especially when VRG gives us this for production. And when there are so many other tracks on Guerrilla Warfare that do the same thing, and are all better, no. This isn't worth it. Next, number 2. These next 2 songs were easy pickings, so let's start with the one that will be fairly high on some rankers' lists. This one sparked a bit of controversy within the community, mostly for its provocative material, but it's not that by itself that puts this song here. In other words, you want to know why Sugar fell back on this list? Because the alternative is this. No joke, I gave this song only one listen before deciding that it wasn't as bad as some of the songs in March. Then I returned to this in May and realized how awful this is. For starters, Could someone tell Gigi McGree not to scream? Every time she does this, she sounds terrible and ruins what could have been a decent vocal performance. And the production is nothing all that special. It starts off with an interpolation of Nirvana's Smell My Teenage Spirit with some really mighty guitars and percussion. It's trying so hard to call back to 2000s rock, but does nothing interesting with it. It's more novelty than anything else. But the big discussion surrounding this song is the content. And I'm gonna be blunt here. What about it? Ignore the cover art and the video for a second, because when you look at the lyrics, the content is extremely tame. It's about Gigi McGree being in a toxic relationship with someone, and when they break up, it's what turns her on. That's it. There's no creative metaphors, no attempt to do anything interesting, and that's why Sugar fell back on this list, because say what you want about the lyrics on that song, at least they tried. Meanwhile, this completely fails at being sexy or provocative, so much so that in order to get the reaction that they wanted from you, they had to make a provocative cover art and music video where Gigi McGree dances around sexually. In other words, they relied on a music video to explain the subtext of their own song. That's the real reason why this is so high on this list. So what's worse? Number 1. Last year's worst, Lost and Found by Phoenix, was pretty controversial. A lot of people didn't think it fit with the rest of the list, and looking back, yeah, they're kinda right. I'm planning on covering other years of Monstercat and by extension redoing that list last year. I'm not sure how controversial this pick will be, but at the same time, I doubt it will be as bad as last time. And it goes back to the mentality that a disappointing song is worse than just a bad song. That's what this song is. And if you've been paying any attention to what I've been saying, you probably know who it is. So the question is, what song is it? Well, it's another one that took its time to sour on me. I didn't like the song at all when I first heard it, but I thought another song was more deserving of this. But after realizing how bad this is months later, especially on this album in particular, yeah, let's put an end to this. For me, it's not even close. This was the song on Thrones of Blood that irritated me the most. And the problems with this song proceeded to swallow it whole despite the decent elements and vocal performance from Sullivan King. So much so that it made Pursuit of Violence miss this list entirely despite the disappointment factor from sudden death. But unlike Britt Larry, I've come to expect better from Sullivan King than just a good vocal performance. And when the rest of your song fails, no, you are not getting a pass for that. And the drops here are the biggest failure. The melodic drop has no punch thanks to the underweight snare and synth stabs. The screeching lead is pushed so far back in the mix. It sounds like a bad attempt to imitate Kai Wachi's style. And given how Kai is on this album, it makes you wonder why Sullivan King didn't get him on here. Casey would have probably done a much better job. And the second drop was one of the worst drops Sullivan King has made his entire career. An abrupt ending to the fake out with a sample from The Rock that sounds quiet compared to everything else, the awful tinny synth stabs, a snare that continues to have no punch, the gang vocals, the screechy lead in the back, the entire core note structure of it. It's dubstep at its most generic and grating. A drop that solidifies the song from bad to outright awful. It's a song I can barely see any appeal to. People who are melodic fans won't like the abrupt heavy drop in the middle of their song. The heavy fans will just skip to the heavy drop anyway and not even acknowledge the melodic one. For people in between, they're probably not going to be satisfied with the drops given how bland the whole track feels, especially when there are tracks on Thrones of Blood that not only do the style better, but there are also tracks that are perfectly fine, solely melodic or heavy. That's why End of Us by Sullivan King is the #1 worst song on Monstercat this year. And while Thrones of Blood in general wasn't terrible, there's a certain track that will make my best list, so stick around for that. This is an ending. It's a really pitiful one. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Did you agree with this list? Whatever your thoughts are, leave it down in the comments below. I'm curious what Monstercat years you guys want me to cover next. I've been thinking of doing more of these lists with past years, starting with 2017. But until then, thanks for watching, and I will see you all soon.